What I'm interested in here and what these citizen science projects are largely trying to tackle is the existing deluge that the flood that we never cleaned up of data that we've been collecting over the last hundreds of years in some cases that has been diligently recorded but cannot be studied longitudinally or in mass because it's trapped in paper.
That was UMSI Assistant Professor Andrea Thomer during a 2021 talk focused on citizen science and the Zooniverse. And this is Information Changes Everything, where we put the spotlight on news and research from the world of information science. You're going to hear from experts, students, researchers, and other people making a real difference. As always, we're presented by the University of Michigan School of Information, UMSI for short. Learn more about us at si.umich.edu. I'm your host, Kate Atkins. Today, we'll hear more from Andrea Thomer during her UMSI mini-class titled A Crash Course in Citizen Science. Thomer emphasizes the importance of involving the public in scientific research, particularly through platforms like Zooniverse, and the critical role of ongoing data curation in preserving scientific knowledge for future research. Before we jump in, a few other people and projects that you should know about. First, Adriana Harmeyer, an archivist at Purdue University and a UMSI alumna, recently achieved a 15-game winning streak on Jeopardy, earning just under $350,000. As an archivist, Harmeyer emphasizes the importance of making archives accessible and enjoys teaching students to use primary sources, aiming to support others in their research and education endeavors. Next, UMSI PhD student Amna Batul is an expert on online privacy and security for women. She recently spoke to the Detroit Free Press about how digitally altered videos and photos known as deepfakes disproportionately harm women in ways that range from emotional and psychological to reputational and economic. Finally, according to Wikipedia, Akira Haraguchi currently holds the unofficial world record for memorizing pi to 100,000 decimal places. But he probably didn't have as much fun as ASAP science guy Mitchell Moffat, who created a catchy song to help you attempt to remember a mere 200 decimal points of pi. You can find the Pi song on his YouTube page. For more on all of these stories, check out si.umich.edu or click the link in our show notes. Now, back to Andrea Thomer.
I am not a Midwesterner by birth. I am from California, where I was a proud product of a community college. And the part that's relevant for today is that while I was in community college, I started volunteering at a museum called the La Brea Tar Pits in Los Angeles, California. And this experience of volunteering there completely changed my life and career interests and trajectory. I eventually got hired there as a full-time fossil excavator. So the La Brea Tar Pits it's this Ice Age fossil locality. The fossils are about 50,000 years old. Anyway, so I got this job randomly because I was an English major based on volunteering there for years. And I learned a lot about paleontology and biology, but I also learned a lot about the need for better data curation practices in our memory institutions. So my focus tends to be in my research. I spend a lot of time still working in natural history museums. So this experience of working with this data and seeing the fragility of these knowledge infrastructures is quite literally what drove me to grad school. I went to the University of Illinois because they had this great data curation program, which I am trying to also, and Michigan also has a great data curation program, but I'm really glad to now be able to continue teaching on these topics and continue to do research on these topics. So yeah, that's some background, and we'll get back to the tar pits in a little bit. But first, I wanted to lay out the agenda for today's mini class. So my hope is that I'll give you a little bit of a crash course in citizen science for scientific data archives, and particularly my experience working with this Zooniverse platform. Okay, so first things first, I wanted to start by defining data curation. By data curation, I mean the work of making a data set fit for purpose and preservation ready. So by fit for purpose, I mean just you need to get the data in a shape so that you can do what it is that you want to do with it. That could mean making an interesting visualization, making a map, or it could mean doing some sort of analysis with R. Each of those different kinds of uses or purposes is going to require different kinds of processing on a data set. And that's what we refer to as the data curation, particularly in an iSchool context or in a library and archives context. When we talk about data curation, we're also talking about the work of making a data set preservation ready. And this is important both for more traditional library and archives concerns of preserving our cultural and science, scholarly heritage. But when you're talking about preserving data sets, scientific data particularly, this is also important so that we can make sure that our scientific results are reproducible and replicable and will stand up to scrutiny in the future. This has become an increasingly important job for information professionals in a huge range of settings. So I teach classes on data curation, and sometimes it's called digital curation here at UMSI. And I tend to pitch them with the idea that people are going to try to work in like academic libraries, mostly because that's a common use case for a lot of our students. In a lot of academic libraries these days, there are roles like data librarian or people that are straight up called data curators, research data managers, people whose job it is to work with the researchers in the university to do this work of getting their data fit for purpose and preservation ready. However, the work of data curation is not at all limited to libraries or archives or places like that. Corporations now have people, they might not call them data curators, which is the really challenging part for our students as they try to get out on the job market. But they'll be hiring people to do things like knowledge management or something, but it's really working with digital data and keeping that alive for the entire staff of a corporation or something like that. All right, the second term that I wanted to make sure to define before we went further is citizen science, or sometimes increasingly called community science. So citizen science, we're going to define as the collection and analysis of data relating to the natural world by members of the general public, typically as part of a collaborative project with professional scientists. So if we were in class, actual class, and I had time to prep you all on how to raise your hand with Zoom, this is where I would ask you to tell me if you had ever participated in a citizen science project. So some examples might include the backyard bird count. This is a really popular one. So annually, and this is sponsored by the Audubon Society, I believe. Basically, folks are asked to go into their backyard and observe and count the birds that they see out there. And this information is shared with professional scientists to help understand changing bird populations or migration patterns over time. And this kind of citizen science is something that's been around for a really long time. It's not something that you necessarily need a computer for. It's really the work of distributing scientific observation to a larger team of people than you could use otherwise. These days, and what I'm going to be really focusing on in this talk, a lot of citizen science is mediated through apps or through platforms that are designed to collect the observations that your community is gathering for you. The platform that I'm talking about more today, though, is this platform called Zooniverse. Zooniverse has been around for, I think, about 15 years at this point. The first project, and so basically it's a platform where people upload images, documents, things like that, large collections of unstructured data that they need help making structured. So this is the documents to data sets aspect of this work. There are two particularly famous examples of really, really successful Zooniverse projects that really focused on this idea of getting people, adding what sometimes it's called humans in the loop, to assist with this manual, like with the kinds of judgments, transcription, and classification work that people can do, but machines are not so good at. So the first one that's pretty famous is called Old Weather. So this was a project looking at ship's logs from I think as far back as the 18th century. As the sailors traveled, they took measurements of things like wind speed, the barometer, so air pressure, and the temperature. Turns out measurements of sea surface temperature particularly are incredibly important for understanding climate change. And it turns out that this massive collection of ship's logs is one of the best records of sea surface temperature prior to the days when we knew to start measuring things like sea surface temperature. So through this Old Weather project, basically the different organizations shared scans of ship logs and had people go through and transcribe the values for the sea surface temperature for different dates over time. This data has now been incorporated into visualizations of a data set called the International Comprehensive Ocean Atmosphere Dataset, aka ICOADS. It's a very catchy title. But this is a data set that's used by climate researchers throughout the world. It's one of the most comprehensive data sets that we have of sea surface temperature. And these transcriptions from these universe volunteers are almost entirely responsible for all of the observations before the 1900. So it's a really, I love this as an example of people making like really important contributions through relatively simple work like transcription to a massively impactful data set. Why do we need projects like this? And for me, I'm particularly interested in them in the context of like natural science repositories, natural history museums, things like that. The context here is that we are dealing with a deluge of legacy data in a lot of these contexts. In the data curation universe, we talk a lot about the data deluge, which means that now that we're using increasingly computational tools and we have this idea of big data, we can access all sorts of massive data sets. We have a deluge of data that we need to curate and work with. What I'm interested in here and what these citizen science projects are largely trying to tackle is the existing deluge that the flood that we never cleaned up of data that we've been collecting over the last hundreds of years in some cases about our natural world that has been diligently recorded in field notes, on index cards, things like that, but cannot be studied longitudinally or in mass because it's trapped in paper. We need to turn the documents into data sets, to go back to my overly alliterative talk title. So that leads to the first project that I'm going to talk about, in which we're trying to tackle these legacy data archives at the Institute for Fisheries Research. So this project is called CHANGES, which stands, and this is a slightly tortured acronym, so bear with me, stands for Collections, Heterogeneous Data, and Next Generation Ecological Studies. And I'm going to focus on the fish collections here at first. What we have been, so like I said, this data set is really rich and has a lot of different kinds of data within it. This really rich and multidimensional heterogeneous data set is going to be absolutely critical for understanding how ecological systems are experiencing and reacting to the unprecedented environmental change that they're currently going through. So the kinds of stressors that we're talking about trying to study in Michigan lakes are things like, we talk about climate change a lot, but that's so abstract. There's a lot of things that are much more closer to home that are having huge impacts on our biodiversity. So particularly for fish populations, you're dealing with things like hydropower. So thinking about how dams are changing, how streams are running, and how they're changing shorelines. Disease and algal blooms, which have been increasing over the last, just have been increasing in recent years. The impact of invasive species, sometimes as a result of people releasing pets that they should not have had in the first place into natural waters, and all sorts of contaminants and pollution, things like nanomaterials, microplastics, and things like that. So this is a really complicated problem. It's really hard to understand. There's so many potential causes here, and there's so many potential ways of studying this. You need a equally messy and complex data set in order to study it. And so our hope is that this IFR collection of 30,000 index cards has some of that data to start understanding the impact on fish species and fish populations based on all of these different stressors that they're experiencing. And this project, we wound up getting funded through an internal grant from MIDAS, which is the Michigan Data Science group. Our goals through this particular project are to develop data science approaches to curating and analyzing high-dimensional, heterogeneous, and noisy data. So in order to answer these scientific questions about what is happening to fish populations, we need to first curate the data. So the thing that I really got excited about in this project is that we're taking data curation as a thing that needs to be done as like a fundamental part of the scientific research that we're doing. It's not auxiliary. It's not something we'll try to take care of later. It is absolutely critical to being able to get this data into shape for us to do this sort of research. We want to leverage this previously underutilized historical data and show how fish populations have changed. So over the last year and a half, we've been working on scanning all of these cards. Initially, we only had a very small subset of these scanned, probably only about 400. And we recruited a student through the UROP program, so that's Undergrad Research Opportunity Program, to help us with the scanning and help set up curatorial workflows. So we've successfully scanned all 30,000 of these cards. The COVID shutdown of campus made us nervous for a while, but we wound up being able to buy a scanner, give it to our undergrad who's been working on this to take to his house. And Kevin Worley, one of my collaborators on this project, has been basically taking boxes of the index cards over to our students' house to do this scanning while we're on lockdown. So it was not great for us. At first we thought that we were really going to be in trouble because of the COVID shutdowns, but we wound up finding a really good workaround. And this wound up being a great way to keep our student employed, which we were really worried about, despite the fact that we couldn't go into our labs in North Quads. We've got this project live on the Zooniverse platform. So if you scroll down here, you see that there are two different options for things that you can get started on. And what these represent are two different transcription workflows that we developed to account for the many different kinds of cards that we're working on. In total, we've developed at least a dozen different workflows for people to go through and transcribe values in these cards. So as you start into the website, it pops up, the first thing you get, I'm logged in with my account, but it still is telling me to go through this tutorial. So we developed this tutorial ourselves through a lot of beta testing with our team and with other students that we were working with. But it is a really nice feature of Zooniverse is that they will have you go through and you have the capacity to actually build these tutorials. And what this workflow is asking me to do is look through what are called fish growth analysis cards and transcribe the age and size data for one particular kind of fish, in this case, walleye or walleye pike. We've chosen this fish because they're a good indicator species, and it's going to be one that we can basically use as a proxy for other populations, is my understanding. These are questions for the ecologist. So the first thing that we have to do is answer this question of, are there any data about walleye in this card? And I see over here that there's something saying yes, we do have information about walleye, so I'm going to click yes, and I go next. And then it takes me through a process of basically transcribing values for each of these cards. So the Zooniverse platform winds up looking very polished. We have 1,462 strangers from the internet that have helped us out on transcribing these cards. They've made what are 126,000 classifications. By classifications, that means transcriptions. That's just Zooniverse speak right there. And we've completed about transcription of 28,000 cards so far. But as you saw, we're only transcribing small amounts of data off of each card. It might turn out that we want to get more data in the future off of these, which means we would have to relaunch the workflow and recruit more people to help us out with this project. We talked a lot about whether or not that was the best approach, but we decided that we didn't want to waste volunteers' time transcribing things for no reason. Rather, we wanted to target the data that we knew would be most useful immediately. And one thing that we've learned through the friends that we found it really important in this project is to build relationships with our volunteers via the message boards and make sure that we're giving them things that they're interested in and show them that we respect their efforts and their contributions to this work. So we're not just treating them as basically like a click farm or something like that. That's transcribing things without having any interest in what they're doing. I highly recommend checking out the message boards. People get really into this. There's a lot of fans of fishing in Michigan. And there's a lot of great conversations about people making their, reflecting back on fish that they've seen, talking about what they think about trends in these communities. It's been really great so far. Future directions for Changes once we get this data mobilized and into a more structured format, our plan is to integrate it with museum specimens so that we can build out this data set even more by looking at specimens that were collected through these fish surveys and basically get some auxiliary data through that. So first of all, the main thing I keep meditating on in this project is that curation, whether it's data curation or just specimen curation, is about long-term care of collections. when I start talking about Zooniverse projects and talk about citizen science, people think that it's basically it's a curate button. Like we have this cool technology, we built this cool workflow, we have a really nice user interface, and once we get done with it, it's done. And that could not be further from the truth. The actual process of getting things transcribed is relatively short, especially compared to the decades long or centuries long history of all of these collections. And so the way that I like to view these projects, and I think it's important to view these projects, is that they are the latest step in a really long series of steps, and they're not possible without that traditional museum or archival preservation work. The Zooniverse does not work as like a magic curation button. It's just a new technology. So a lot of these technologies are just new tools for us to use, but they need to be used in consort with existing best practices.
You can watch the full talk by clicking the link in our show notes. To learn more about upcoming events like this, visit us at umsi.info/events. And tune in next time to hear from UMSI postdoctoral research fellow Nathan Tablanthis. Tablanthis' research examines overlapping online communities on platforms like Reddit and Facebook, finding that they often coexist through mutualism rather than competition.
I think that stepping back from just trying to explain the phenomenon of overlapping communities is to ask the question, why do we even have the online communities that we do? And this is actually a pretty hard question to answer, in part because the distribution of participation is so unequal. But it's an important question because these online communities that are arriving, they structure who is producing what for whom and where online.
That's in our next episode. Before we go, if you love being the first person to know about new information science research, be sure to request a free subscription to UMSI's Research Roundup. It's a summary of the latest findings from researchers at the University of Michigan School of Information. We'll be happy to add you to the email list at umsi.info/research-email. The University of Michigan School of Information creates and shares knowledge so that people like you will use information with technology to build a better world. Don't forget to subscribe to Information Changes Everything on your favorite podcast platform. And if you've got questions, comments, or episode ideas, send us an email at umsipodcast@umich.edu. From all of us at the University of Michigan School of Information, thanks for listening.